Imagine this. You're a young woman in the 1840s. You've traveled miles to a beautiful estate in the rolling hills of western Georgia. You believe you're about to marry a wealthy man, start a family, and secure your future. But instead of a wedding, your name vanishes from every record. Your family never hears from you again. This isn't a ghost story your grandma told by the fire. This really happened, and it happened 47 times, all in the same place. Welcome to the story of the Pritchard plantation, a place so dark that local historians still hesitate to talk about it. Tonight, we're going to step inside its crumbling ruins, dig into the hidden records, and uncover what happened to those missing brides, and why the Pritchard name was erased from history. The Forgotten Estate. The remains of the Pritchard plantation sit about 15 miles from the town of Cartersville, Georgia. Just broken bricks, collapsing chimneys, and a patch of land choked with weeds. But in its prime, this estate was 3,000 acres of fertile farmland along the twisting Etowah River, rich soil, perfect for cotton. The patriarch, Cornelius Pritchard, bought it in 1842 for $8,000 from a bankrupt Virginia tobacco merchant. In today's money, that's more than $250,000. The river made the land more than just valuable, it was strategic. You could float cotton straight down to the Coosa River, and from there, all the way to Mobile Bay and international ports. Cornelius didn't just buy a farm, he bought power. The Pritchard family. Cornelius was not like other wealthy planters in Georgia. While his neighbors built grand mansions and threw lavish parties, Cornelius kept his distance. He had a wife, Margaret, and 5 adult sons, Thomas, Elias, Henry, Samuel, and Robert. All 5 were unmarried, each well into their 30s. And they all had the same public story. They were searching for the perfect wives. The way they went about it was strange. They never courted local women. Instead, they placed quiet word with distant families and traveling pastors, spreading the message that the Pritchard sons were wealthy, honorable, and ready to marry. They offered to cover travel costs for any young woman willing to journey to the estate. It worked. Between 1842 and 1863, 47 women arrived at the Pritchard plantation, and not one of them was ever seen again. A secret buried for over a century. The truth about what happened during those wedding nights was hidden for generations. The Pritchards kept meticulous family records, but they were locked away. It wasn't until 1987, when a contractor renovating an old Cartersville property stumbled upon a rotting trunk in an attic, that pieces of the puzzle emerged. Inside were letters, diaries, and something worse, signed marriage contracts, for dozens of women whose names do not appear in any local church registry, census record, or graveyard. 3 separate historical societies refused to authenticate the documents, not because they thought they were fake, but because they were too disturbing to put their name on. The perfect trap. To understand how this happened, you have to understand the time period. In the 1840s, for many women, marriage wasn't just a dream, it was survival. Without a husband, your options were limited. Work as a servant, rely on distant relatives, or face poverty. So when an invitation came from a wealthy family promising marriage, security, and a comfortable home, it was almost impossible to refuse. Especially if the man was willing to pay your travel costs. The Pritchards exploited this vulnerability perfectly. Georgia's golden age of cotton. This all took place during Georgia's cotton boom. In 1842, cotton was selling for nearly 12 cents a pound, a historic high. Plantations expanded, railroads were connecting new regions, and fortunes were being made. Cornelius Pritchard fit right into this world, at least on paper. His estate was large, his crops were thriving, and the river gave him an edge over his competitors. But while other plantation owners flaunted their wealth, Cornelius kept his life, and his family, shrouded in secrecy. Even at church in Cartersville, he'd sit quietly, leave as soon as the service ended, and avoid small talk with neighbors. Locals noticed. They whispered. But no one ever asked too many questions, because in the South of that era, a man with money and land was not someone you accused without proof. The last bride before the war. The final known bride to arrive at the Pritchard plantation came in the spring of 1863, during the height of the Civil War. Her name, according to one letter in the trunk, was Eliza Mayfield from Augusta. She was just 19 years old. The letter says she was full of excitement for the wedding to come, and that she found the family most welcoming. That's where her trail ends. Within months, Union forces moved into the region, the plantation was abandoned, and the Pritchard family disappeared from all county records. Some say they fled west. Others believe they were killed. But the truth is something far darker. The darkness to come. What was in those hidden records? What happened inside that mansion on those wedding nights? Over the next chapters, we're going to break down the documents from that 1987 discovery. We'll read letters written by the brides themselves, some of them only hours before they vanished. And we'll uncover the methodical, chilling plan that made the Pritchard plantation one of the most disturbing true stories in Southern history. The kind of story that keeps even experienced historians awake at night. This is just the beginning. If you want, I can also add a mini cliffhanger for the end of part 1 so viewers feel compelled to click straight into part 2. That would strengthen retention for a YouTube series. Do you want me to add that now? Part 2: The Trunk in the Attic. Hook. Sometimes history doesn't hide in dusty libraries or locked archives. Sometimes, it waits for someone to open the wrong box. In 1987, a renovation crew in Cartersville, Georgia, found something that would change the way locals saw the past forever. It wasn't gold. It wasn't Civil War relics. It was a rotting wooden trunk, covered in dust and spiderwebs. And inside, a collection of papers so disturbing that 3 historical societies refused to even put their name on them. Tonight, we open that trunk. The discovery. The house where the trunk was found wasn't the Pritchard plantation, it was a 2-story brick home on West Main Street in Cartersville. Built in the 1880s, it had passed through several owners over the years. By the late 1980s, the house was falling apart. A young couple bought it with plans to restore it. As the renovation crew worked their way through the attic, they pushed aside a pile of warped boards and insulation, and there it was. A large, cedar-lined trunk. The hinges were rusted, and one corner had collapsed from water damage. The smell hit them first, a heavy mix of mildew and something faintly metallic. When they pried it open, they found stacks of old papers tied with faded ribbon, brittle diaries, letters in neat cursive, and a small cloth pouch that rattled when shaken. First reactions. At first, the crew thought they'd found a family archive. But as they flipped through the top few letters, they realized something was wrong. These weren't casual notes. They were contracts. Formal agreements, each naming a young woman, her place of origin, and the date she was to arrive at the Pritchard estate for matrimony. Every contract was signed in ink, on one side by Cornelius Pritchard, on the other by either the woman herself or a family member. There were dozens of them. The names. Many of the women's names didn't match anything in Bartow County's marriage or death records. Local historians would later confirm that no church in the area ever recorded weddings for these brides. One diary entry, written by a woman named Sarah Whitcomb from Savannah, described her first night at the plantation in chilling detail. "Greater than, the gentlemen are polite, but I find the halls drafty and the air most peculiar. I was given a room at the far end of the second floor. Mrs. Pritchard instructed me to lock my door from the inside and not to open it, no matter who knocked, until sunrise." Sarah's diary ends the very next day. The cloth pouch. Inside the pouch, they found small objects. A gold locket, a hair ribbon, a broken cameo pin, and a tiny porcelain button. Each was wrapped in scrap paper with a woman's name scrawled on it. It looked like someone had been keeping trophies. Trying to verify the records. The couple who owned the house contacted the local historical society. The society's archivist examined the papers, but after reading just a handful of documents, she turned pale. She told them to put everything back in the trunk and leave it in a secure place. Word spread quickly among Georgia historians. A group from Atlanta came to review the find. Then another group from the University of Georgia. In the end, all three agreed on one thing. These documents were real, but none of them wanted to be the first to make it public. The timeline of disappearances. The papers in the trunk revealed a chilling timeline. The first recorded marriage agreement was dated April 17, 1842. The last was dated May 3, 1863, just months before Union forces moved into the region. There were 47 contracts in total. Many of the agreements mentioned travel arrangements, stagecoach tickets, steamboat fares, paid for by the Pritchard family. Several also mentioned a gift upon arrival, though none described what the gift was. Letters from the brides. Some of the letters were written by the women themselves, likely sent to family during their journey or upon reaching the plantation. One, from a woman named Eliza Mayfield, the final known bride, read, "Greater than, I am here at last. The house is large and old, with a strange air about it, though I cannot place why. The gentlemen are reserved, though kind enough. Mrs. Pritchard has given me a gown to wear for the wedding. I am told the ceremony will be at night, by candlelight, as is their custom. I shall write again tomorrow." There is no second letter from Eliza. Why were the papers here? The biggest mystery wasn't just the contents, it was why the trunk ended up miles away from the plantation. One theory is that when the Pritchards abandoned their land in 1863, some possessions were sent to relatives in town. Over the decades, the papers may have been passed quietly between families who didn't want their names connected to the estate's dark history. Another theory is that someone wanted the records hidden, but not destroyed. As if they knew one day, the truth would need to come out. The strange map. At the very bottom of the trunk was a folded, hand-drawn map. It showed the layout of the Pritchard estate, main house, barns, workers' quarters, gardens, and something else. In a grove of trees near the riverbank was a small square marked simply, "Chapel." No record exists of a chapel on the plantation. In fact, no photographs or paintings show any building in that spot. But several diary entries referenced night services held there. One even described strange music drifting from the grove after midnight. The chilling pattern. When the documents were arranged chronologically, another detail emerged. Almost every bride arrived within 3 days of a full moon. Coincidence? Maybe. But the letters also mentioned the Pritchard wedding tradition of holding the ceremony late at night, sometimes past midnight, by candlelight. What kind of wedding needed the cover of darkness? Local reactions. When fragments of the story leaked into Cartersville gossip, older residents nodded knowingly. That place was always cursed, one man told a local reporter. Another recalled his grandmother warning children never to play near the old plantation ruins. And then there was a story, told quietly, about a group of boys who went exploring the property in the 1940s. They claimed to have found a stone door in the ground near the river. When they tried to open it, they heard something scraping from the other side. The decision to investigate. The couple who found the trunk eventually turned it over to a private researcher, a man named Drive. William Harding. Harding spent years piecing together the story, cross-referencing the names in the contracts with missing person reports, shipping logs, and personal diaries from the time. What he found convinced him that the plantation wasn't just the scene of disappearances, it was the center of something much bigger. Something ritualistic. And the chapel, on that hand-drawn map. He believed it still existed, hidden deep in the woods along the Etowah River. Cliffhanger ending. In Part 3, we're going to follow Drive, Harding's investigation into the land where the plantation once stood. We'll walk the same path those brides took on their wedding nights. And we'll see what's left of that forgotten chapel. Some say it's gone. Others say it's still waiting. I can make Part 3 continue directly with Harding and the exploration of the chapel area, slowly moving from historical mystery into more chilling horror as we uncover what happened there. Do you want me to go straight into Part 3 next so the flow stays seamless? Part 3: The House Built for Secrets. Hook. From the road, the Pritchard plantation looked like any other grand southern estate. But step inside the gates, and you'd realize, it wasn't built for comfort. It wasn't built for show. It was built for control. And when Dr. Harding first laid eyes on the old maps of the property, he knew, this place had been designed to hide something. The land. The plantation stretched across nearly 3,000 acres of fertile Bartow County soil, bordered on one side by the slow, twisting Etowah River. In the 1840s, this location was perfect. The river didn't just water the crops, it connected to the Coosa River, which led straight down to Mobile Bay and the shipping routes beyond. For a man like Cornelius Pritchard, that meant his cotton could reach Europe without ever touching a major Georgia port. It was a fortune in farmland. But the way the Pritchards lived on it was strange. The family that kept to itself. In the world of antebellum Georgia, plantation owners were expected to be public figures, hosting dinners, throwing dances, building connections. Cornelius wasn't like that. He went to the Presbyterian church in Cartersville every Sunday, always sitting in the same pew, always leaving the moment the service ended. No handshakes. No lingering conversations. His 5 adult sons, Thomas, Elias, Henry, Samuel, and Robert, were even more unusual. By 1842, the youngest was 28, the oldest 36. In a society where men married at 22 to start families and secure heirs, all 5 Pritchard men were still single. They claimed they were searching for worthy wives. They had money. They had land. But year after year, no weddings ever happened. The main house. The plantation's mansion sat almost 2 miles from the main road, at the end of a winding path that crossed 3 narrow wooden bridges over small creeks. Visitors described it as isolated and oddly quiet. Unlike the grand Greek Revival homes of other planters, the Pritchard house didn't have a central hallway with rooms flowing into each other for entertaining guests. Instead, it had multiple wings, each connected by covered walkways. Every wing could be shut off completely from the others. In the basement, there were rooms with no windows, sealed behind heavy oak doors with massive iron locks. Nobody could explain why a cotton plantation needed such rooms. The workers. For an estate of that size, the Pritchards employed surprisingly few slaves, just 12, who lived nearly a mile from the main house. That distance was unusual. Most planters kept domestic slaves close for efficiency. Instead, Cornelius relied heavily on 3 white overseers: Tobias Hartwell, Duncan Lowry, and Silas Vance. Tobias Hartwell. Hartwell was lean, with prematurely gray hair and hands calloused from rope work. He said he'd managed properties along the Savannah River, but no one could find a record of it. Neighbors noted he seemed more skilled at tying knots than planting crops. Duncan Lowry. Lowry was a giant of a man, built like a blacksmith. He spoke with a Tennessee Hill Country accent but avoided talking about his past. One man joked that Lowry looked like he could stop a runaway horse with his bare hands. Others whispered that he'd be more suited to restraining a struggling person. Silas Vance. The youngest of the 3, Vance had sharp, restless eyes and a habit of constantly scanning his surroundings. People said he was more comfortable carrying a weapon than a farming tool. None of them mixed with locals. None of them had families. And all 3 arrived in Bartow County around the same time the Pritchards did, without explanation. A house that watched you. Several letters in the 1987 trunk described the house from the perspective of the brides-to-be. One woman wrote about being shown to a wing of the house that could be locked from the outside. Another mentioned hearing footsteps above her room late at night, even though she'd been told no one else was in that part of the house. A diary entry from Sarah Whitcomb noted, "The doors here are heavy, with locks not meant for privacy but for keeping one in place. I cannot shake the feeling that I am being measured." The isolated bridges. Those 3 wooden bridges leading to the main house weren't just for crossing creeks. Harding believed they served another purpose. In the 1800s, they could easily be removed, or burned, cutting off the property from the outside world. In fact, one letter hinted that guests were always brought to the plantation by wagon, never allowed to ride their own horses up to the house. Harding noted this would make it nearly impossible for a bride to leave on her own. Patterns of control. By comparing the plantation's layout with the names and dates in the contracts, Harding saw a clear pattern. Brides were placed in separate wings of the house, often the farthest from the family's own quarters. Most arrived late in the afternoon or evening, giving them little daylight to explore the grounds. The overseers were always involved in greeting new arrivals, never just family members. Why the isolation? Cornelius told curious neighbors that the house's design and location were to keep the mind on business, not society. But Harding thought otherwise. The isolation, the sealed-off rooms, the locked basement, the distant workers' quarters, it all looked like a property designed to control movement and limit witnesses. And that made the chapel on the map from the trunk even more suspicious. Hartwell's ledger. While searching courthouse archives, Harding found an 1849 property inventory signed by Tobias Hartwell. It listed standard plantation items: plows, carts, cotton gins, but also chains, shackles, and restraints, iron, for personal holding. There was no explanation for why a cotton plantation needed such equipment. A whispered story. One elderly Bartow County resident told Harding a story passed down from her grandmother. She claimed that on certain nights, lights could be seen flickering in the grove by the river, where no buildings stood. She said her grandmother once followed the lights from a distance and heard a woman crying, then singing, then nothing at all. Cliffhanger ending. Harding knew the only way to get answers was to walk that land himself. The plantation was long abandoned, the house a ruin, but the woods along the Etowah still stood. And if the chapel was real, he planned to find it. In Part 4, we follow Harding's steps into the grove, where the trees still grow thick, and the air carries a sound you can't quite explain. Some say it's the wind. Others say it's the brides. If you want, I can make Part 4 go full tension. Harding entering the overgrown plantation site at night, uncovering physical remnants of the chapel, and starting to hear and see things that shouldn't be there, while still tying in the historical evidence. Do you want me to move straight into Part 4? Part 4, The First Bride. Hook. Sometimes, evil doesn't begin with a scream. Sometimes, it starts with a smile, and a story everyone wants to believe. In September of 1843, Jeremiah Pritchard, the eldest of the Pritchard brothers, came back from a month-long trip to Augusta with an announcement that would change everything. He had found his perfect bride. Her name was Sarah Pemberton. And she would be the first known woman to walk into the Pritchard plantation, and never walk out. The men who guarded the house. Before we get to Sarah, you need to understand the people who kept the Pritchard estate running, the three overseers. Tobias Hartwell was thin, with prematurely gray hair and hands rough from rope work. He said he'd worked along the Savannah River, managing other plantations, but no one could prove it. People noticed he was more skilled with knots than with a plow. Duncan Lowry was a massive man, built like a blacksmith. His Tennessee accent gave him a friendly air, but he avoided talking about his past. Folks joked he could stop a runaway horse with one arm. Others thought he looked better suited to holding someone down. Silas Vance was the youngest, quick-eyed, always scanning the room. Neighbors said he seemed more at ease with a pistol than with a hoe. All three had shown up in Bartow County around the same time as the Pritchards, and none of them had family in the area. The brothers' strange travels. While the overseers kept the plantation running, the Pritchard sons had a habit that puzzled everyone. They took long trips, sometimes for months, claiming to visit distant relatives or explore new business ventures. But they never all left at once. At least 3 brothers stayed home at any given time, as if making sure the plantation was never left unguarded. When they came back, they often talked about promising young ladies they'd met, potential brides from faraway towns. Declining local matches. In Southern society, respectable marriages were usually arranged through trusted family connections. In Cartersville, Mrs. Henrietta Cumberland was the unofficial matchmaker for the town's elite families. She introduced eligible bachelors to daughters of prominent households. She offered to arrange meetings for the Pritchard brothers more than once. They always declined politely, saying they already had good prospects from their travels. Mrs. Cumberland thought their approach was ridiculous and risky. In her diary, she wrote that the brothers' way of seeking brides, in distant places and without the oversight of family, was not only strange, but a danger to their reputation. The first recorded case. Historians believe there were earlier victims, but the first case we can confirm happened in September 1843. That's when Jeremiah Pritchard returned from Augusta with the news. He was engaged to Sarah Pemberton, a 19-year-old seamstress. Sarah's story. Sarah's father, a blacksmith, had died of consumption earlier that year. His death left the family's shop without its main worker, and his wife, Sarah's mother, was too ill to continue the business. They were on the edge of losing everything. Sarah had been sewing for wealthy Augusta families, doing her best to support them, when she met Jeremiah. He told friends they'd crossed paths by chance at the city's main church. He described her as pious, skilled in domestic duties, intelligent, and unspoiled by the airs of high society. In his words, she was exactly what he'd been searching for. Why she was perfect, for them. Jeremiah emphasized that Sarah had few close relatives. That meant there would be no large family to interfere, and no powerful in-laws to question her sudden move. He told neighbors this was actually a blessing. Sarah could devote herself entirely to her new life on the plantation. The strange wedding plans. Here's where things became unsettling. Jeremiah insisted that the courtship and wedding be kept entirely private. He claimed Sarah was delicate, and that meeting many new people would overwhelm her. He didn't want any visitors to the plantation before the ceremony. In the South, where weddings were often community events, this was highly unusual. No witnesses. The date for the wedding came and went without any of the family's acquaintances being invited. No church in Cartersville or Augusta recorded a marriage for Jeremiah Pritchard and Sarah Pemberton. A few weeks later, Jeremiah appeared in town alone. When asked about his new wife, he smiled and said she was settling in and adjusting to plantation life. No one in Cartersville ever saw Sarah. Dr. Harding's notes. In the trunk found in 1987, there was a small, brittle paper with Sarah's name on it. It was wrapped around a single porcelain button, the kind used on women's dresses in the 1840s. Harding wrote in his journal, "Greater than, if Sarah Pemberton truly existed, and the evidence suggests she did, then she may have been the first documented victim of what became a 20-year pattern." Why no one spoke up? Back then, missing persons cases for women like Sarah were rarely investigated. A young woman moving to live with her husband could simply lose touch with her old life. Without powerful family to demand answers, her absence barely caused a ripple. The Pritchards knew this. They chose their brides carefully, alone, vulnerable, and without strong ties. More brides to come. After Sarah, the pattern continued. Another bride every few months, each from a different town, each brought back quietly. The Pritchards always had a story. She's shy, she's ill, she prefers to keep to the home. No one in Cartersville saw any of them. Cliffhanger ending. In Part 5, we're going to uncover the letters some of these women sent on their journeys to the plantation, letters that never reached their families. One of them describes the night she arrived at the Pritchard estate, and the strange music coming from the grove by the river. If you want, I can write Part 5 so that it's the most unsettling yet, combining the bride's last letters with Harding's visit to the grove at night, where the music might still be heard. Do you want me to prepare that next? Part 5. The announcement of Jeremiah Pritchard's impending marriage came as a mild surprise to the residents of Cartersville, though not an unwelcome one. Jeremiah, at 37, was long considered overdue for matrimony, yet his manner of revealing the news, and the unusual conditions he placed upon the occasion, would linger in the town's memory far longer than the event itself. He spoke with quiet satisfaction about Miss Sarah Pemberton, a 19-year-old from Augusta whose father, a blacksmith, had recently succumbed to consumption, leaving her mother an invalid and the household in financial ruin. Jeremiah portrayed her as a paragon of modest virtue, pious, industrious, and unspoiled by the pretensions of wealth. Her circumstances, he explained, had given her a clarity of purpose and moral fortitude lacking in the more cosseted young ladies of Georgia's established families. What struck some observers as peculiar was Jeremiah's insistence on privacy. There would be no elaborate engagement dinner, no parade of calls from Cartersville's most prominent families. Instead, the wedding was to be a small, strictly family affair, followed, at some undefined point, by a community celebration. His reasoning, delivered with solemn gravity, was that Miss Pemberton possessed a delicate constitution, and sudden immersion into a new social environment might be too great a strain. In an era when the so-called nervous disorders of refined young women were accepted as medical fact, such caution appeared almost gallant. On the evening of September 23, 1843, a covered carriage approached the Pritchard plantation at sunset. Several neighbors, including Mrs. Eleanor Fairchild from the adjoining property, took note. The carriage's canvas covering concealed its passengers entirely, and instead of a family slave driving the team, it was Tobias Hartwell at the reins, his face set in grim concentration. The vehicle bore no heraldic crest, no brass-mounted lamps or polished trim to announce the arrival of a bride. Its plainness was almost jarring. The carriage disappeared into the plantation's inner grounds. For the next 3 days, no visitors were admitted. Curtains remained drawn in the main house. At night, Mrs. Fairchild, whose vantage from a ridge allowed glimpses of the outbuildings, observed lanterns passing in deliberate sequence between the house and a small structure near the riverbank. Once, in the pre-dawn stillness of September 26, she heard the rumble of wagon wheels on the private road, accompanied by hushed voices. She would later confess to hearing muffled cries on more than one occasion during those 3 nights, though she doubted her own recollection at the time, attributing it to foxes or the shifting timbers of the plantation buildings. When Jeremiah next appeared in Cartersville a week later, he reported that his bride had taken ill with a fever soon after arrival. He spoke with convincing concern, describing her as too weak for visitors, too easily agitated for conversation. No physician was called, not even Drive Marcus Hewitt, who served the entire district. Jeremiah explained that Sarah had a near-paralyzing fear of male doctors, and that her modesty could not be compromised. In a society that held female chastity and propriety as paramount, such reasoning carried weight. Weeks became months. In October, Jeremiah told inquirers the fever lingered. In November, that she had suffered a fall during a brief convalescence. By December, neighbors began to murmur at the oddity of her never being seen beyond the Pritchard gates. Dr. Hewitt privately noted the strangeness of a prominent family relying entirely on home remedies for a prolonged illness. When pressed, Jeremiah claimed to have consulted specialists in Atlanta, who had prescribed complete isolation from all outside influences. Sarah Pemberton vanished from conversation soon after. There was no funeral in Cartersville, no headstone in the local burying ground. The only acknowledgement of her fate came in Jeremiah's muted reference to a loss too deep for public display, which effectively ended all inquiry. The pattern that began with Sarah would be repeated, refined, one might say, over the next 2 decades. Each Pritchard son would, at some point, return from travels in distant cities with news of an engagement to a young woman of modest means, often recently bereaved, always without strong family networks to intervene on her behalf. Courtships were conducted far from Cartersville. The brides arrived under cover of dusk. Days of seclusion followed, and, without exception, the young women either took ill or otherwise disappeared from public view. The second occurrence came scarcely 6 months later. In the spring of 1844, Obadiah Pritchard rode in from Savannah with word of his betrothal to Miss Charlotte Hendricks, an 18-year-old whose father, a dock worker, had drowned while securing cargo in a winter storm. Orphaned and without siblings, Charlotte had been supporting herself in a waterfront boarding house. Obadiah's account, strikingly similar to Jeremiah's before him, emphasized her resilience, domestic skill, and moral character. He spoke with barely concealed disdain of the soft-handed young women of wealthy lineage, contrasting them unfavorably with Charlotte's hard-earned virtues. Her arrival mirrored Sarah's almost exactly. A covered carriage, driven not by a slave but by one of the trusted overseers, coming up the road at twilight. For 3 days, the plantation gates remained shut. Neighbors again noted lamplight flickering in the vicinity of the river outbuildings. When Charlotte was finally mentioned again, she too was said to be ill, feverish, weakened, unable to receive guests. The symptoms were identical to Sarah's, as were the explanations. Her modesty forbade examination by a local physician. Isolation was necessary to prevent a relapse. By midwinter she was gone. No body was viewed, no service attended, only vague talk of burial in her home city, according to her wishes. 2 young brides lost in less than a year did not go unnoticed. Though the Pritchards maintained their social standing through a careful mixture of hospitality and reserve, whispers began in the parlors of Cartersville. Dr. Hewitt's professional unease sharpened into suspicion. He began making unannounced calls to the plantation, under the pretense of offering condolences and medical guidance. Each time he was met at the gate by an overseer, usually Hartwell, who expressed regret that the family was too stricken for company. Requests to see death certificates or confirm burial arrangements were politely deflected. The Pritchards claimed the matters had been handled privately through contacts in Atlanta, far from local jurisdiction. The explanation for this remoteness was presented as a matter of respect for the deceased women's natal families, whose customs, Jeremiah and Obadiah insisted, ought to be honored over those of their brief marital ties. Such reasoning, cloaked in the language of propriety, proved difficult to challenge openly. Yet among the more perceptive members of the community, the impression was taking root that the Pritchard estate was touched by some private calamity, a malady that afflicted only its newly arrived brides, and for which no public accounting would ever be given. It would be many years before these early incidents were recognized as the first movements in a long and sinister pattern, one that would eventually place the Pritchard name in the darker annals of Georgia's antebellum history. If you'd like, I can now continue directly into Part 6 so the pacing remains seamless and the tension escalates naturally without breaking the historical voice. Part 6: The Widow's Lies. By the summer of 1845, something ugly began to stir beneath the polite smiles of the community. People started whispering. Not loudly, of course, Southern manners didn't allow that, but quietly, in corners, over teacups and behind church doors. And the whispers all carried the same question. Why didn't the Pritchard brothers act like widowers? Jeremiah and Obadiah both claimed to have lost their wives. But they didn't mourn. They didn't wear the black armbands or dark suits that tradition demanded. They didn't stay home in grief or avoid public gatherings. In fact, they were at every social event, smiling, laughing, and looking for the next business deal. In the South of the 1840s, widowhood was practically a performance. You dressed the part, avoided dances, and showed your sorrow for months, sometimes years. But the Pritchard brothers, they behaved as if nothing tragic had happened at all. That alone was strange, but the next discovery made things much worse. Reverend Samuel Coggins of the Cartersville Methodist Church had a reputation for keeping his records in perfect order. Every wedding, every funeral, every detail was written down. So when he tried to find the marriage entries for Jeremiah and Obadiah, he expected them to be there. They weren't. There was no Sarah Pemberton. No Charlotte Hendricks. Not a trace. It was as if those weddings had never happened. When confronted, old Cornelius Pritchard produced a letter, supposedly from Reverend Theodore Martindale of the First Baptist Church of Augusta. The letter claimed that both weddings had been performed there, at the bride's request, in the same church where their late parents had been married. The paper carried an official-looking seal. But people noticed strange things. The wording was off, the theology didn't quite match Baptist teachings, and the whole thing felt wrong. Then came the final blow. No Reverend Theodore Martindale had ever existed in Augusta. The Baptist church there had no record of the Pritchard family at all. Cornelius, smooth as ever, explained it away with another story: private ceremonies, visiting ministers, special family arrangements. Always just enough detail to make you think, well, maybe. In 1846, Ezekiel Pritchard announced his engagement to Miss Rebecca Thornton, a young woman from Tennessee whose merchant father had supposedly died in a steamboat accident. By now, the pattern was obvious to anyone paying attention. Mrs. Fairchild, who lived on the neighboring property, decided she was paying attention. She began keeping detailed notes, carefully hidden away. Her records, found decades later in that trunk of family documents, would reveal what really happened on the plantation during those wedding celebrations. Her notes didn't describe music or laughter. They told of wagons arriving at night, loaded with rope, heavy canvas, and metal restraints that had no place in a normal household. She wrote about strangers, men who weren't local, arriving quietly by boat along the Etowah River. They came after sunset and were gone before dawn. And she heard things. Not singing, not dancing, but muffled cries, human cries, coming from the direction of a small outbuilding near the river. She heard the thud of heavy objects being loaded into wagons under cover of darkness. The slaves on the Pritchard plantation seemed to know something was wrong. They avoided certain parts of the property, clinging together near their quarters at night. Their fear was so deep they wouldn't even fetch water after dark. Over time, the full picture of the Pritchards' operation began to emerge. They weren't sloppy criminals acting on impulse. They were running a system. Each son had his own hunting grounds. Jeremiah worked Georgia and South Carolina. Obadiah stayed near the coast, Savannah, Charleston. Ezekiel targeted Tennessee and northern Alabama. Matthias and Caleb took Virginia and North Carolina. They weren't chasing just any women. They sought out those who were isolated, desperate, and unlikely to be missed. Young women without parents, orphans, daughters of men who had died in debt, women who had already been cut off from their families because of scandal or financial ruin. In those days, an unmarried woman with no family support had two futures: poverty or marriage. And a proposal from a wealthy plantation owner wasn't just romance. It was rescue. The Pritchards played the part perfectly: gentle, respectable, well-mannered. They didn't rush. They spent weeks in a town, renting rooms, making business deals, going to church, chatting with shopkeepers. By the time they proposed, the entire community believed them to be honorable men. And then, once the wedding came, the bride vanished. They were clever about it. In the 1840s, communication between states was painfully slow. There were no quick phone calls, no instant letters. If a woman married and moved far away, her friends might wait months for a letter, and when it didn't come, there was no easy way to track her down. The Pritchards timed their courtships and disappearances to fit these natural gaps in communication. And if someone did get suspicious, they always had an excuse. The new wife was ill. She was shy. She didn't like to travel. The Pritchards knew how to sound just believable enough. Looking back, what makes it all so chilling is how organized they were. This wasn't greed in the heat of the moment. It was planned. Every trip, every meeting, every marriage was part of a cold, deliberate process. Mrs. Fairchild's final notes from that year end with a single line, underlined twice. Greater than, it is not death these women meet, it is something worse. She didn't live to see her suspicions proven. But her words would echo in the shadows of Cartersville for years to come. Because by the end of 1846, the Pritchards were not slowing down. They were just getting started. If you want, I can now prepare part 7 to follow directly from this tone, picking up where the brothers' crimes escalate and the danger grows. Would you like me to continue the next part? Richard Lineage, Part 7. By 1848, the whispers had grown into quiet but persistent suspicion. Even those who once defended the Pritchard brothers began to avoid speaking their names too loudly in public, as though the mere mention might draw unwelcome attention. The plantation itself took on an air of guarded secrecy. Its gates, once open to passing neighbors and tradesmen, now remained closed except for the occasional delivery wagon or discreet visitor who came and went at odd hours. It was during this period that a new and troubling figure entered the periphery of the family's operations, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a deep scar that ran from the corner of his mouth to his chin. He was introduced publicly as Mr. Ransom, a distant cousin from Virginia, though no one in the surrounding counties could recall ever hearing of such a relative. Mrs. Fairchild, whose vigilance never wavered, noted in her journal that Ransom's arrival coincided with a noticeable change in the brothers' methods. The courtships became shorter, the disappearances more frequent, and the signs of celebration, already rare, vanished altogether. What replaced them was efficiency. Cold, deliberate efficiency. Neighbors noticed that the wedding announcements, once made with polite public flourish, were now handled quietly, sometimes not even shared until after the supposed ceremony had taken place. The newlywed brides were seen only briefly, if at all, before vanishing into the same 3-day shadow that had claimed their predecessors. In the spring of 1849, one such case involved Miss Eleanor Brightwell, a quiet, bookish woman from Charleston who had come to Georgia under the care of an elderly aunt. Eleanor was said to have inherited a modest dowry after her parents died in a yellow fever outbreak. It was enough to make her a respectable match, but not enough to protect her from misfortune. Ezekiel Pritchard appeared in her life one Sunday morning at church, wearing the solemn black coat and gold watch chain that had become his signature. Within a month, the two were said to be engaged. Mrs. Fairchild's notes from that week describe hearing wagon wheels late at night, the sound of men speaking in low, hurried voices, and something else, something she struggled to put into words. A dragging sound, she finally wrote. As though some great weight were being pulled across the ground. The next morning, the Brightwell aunt was seen sitting alone on her porch, staring blankly at the road. When a neighbor approached to ask about the wedding, the woman simply shook her head and whispered, "She's gone." No explanation, no farewell, only absence. It was around this time that Reverend Coggins, still troubled by the earlier inconsistencies in the brothers' marriage records, made a bold decision. He traveled to Augusta in person, determined to uncover the truth about the elusive Reverend Martindale and the supposed Baptist ceremonies. His journey took nearly a week, and when he returned, his face was pale with what he had learned, or perhaps with what he had failed to find. Martindale had never existed. No such weddings had ever been performed in Augusta for any members of the Pritchard family. The seals and signatures on the letters Cornelius had shown years earlier were crude forgeries, some copied from legitimate church documents, others invented entirely. Yet when Reverend Coggins tried to share his findings with county officials, he was met with polite but firm dismissal. The Pritchards were wealthy landowners with influence in both commerce and politics. Without undeniable proof of wrongdoing, there was nothing the law was willing, or perhaps able, to do. In the fall of 1850, the Etowah River flooded after weeks of heavy rain. It was during this flood that the first true piece of physical evidence came to light. A large, waterlogged crate washed up nearly 2 miles downstream from the Pritchard property. Its lid was cracked open, revealing a bundle of mildewed cloth and what appeared to be rotted wood. Local fisherman Samuel Haskins, who found it, pried the crate apart in search of salvageable goods. What he found instead caused him to stumble backward into the mud. Inside were bones. Human bones. The coroner who examined them determined they belonged to a young woman, though the remains were too badly damaged by water to allow for proper identification. The discovery was whispered about in taverns and general stores, yet no one dared publicly connect it to the Pritchards, not when so many livelihoods in Bartow County depended, directly or indirectly, on their business. But Mrs. Fairchild did connect it. In her journal, she described how the crate had been painted in a dull, reddish-brown color she had seen before, on the outbuilding by the river where she had so often heard those muffled cries. By now, the brothers' enterprise had grown bolder. Ransom, the scarred man, seemed to act as both enforcer and organizer. He was seen purchasing heavy canvas, tar, and barrels of quicklime from suppliers in neighboring towns, always under different names. More river traffic moved in and out of the property at night, suggesting that the Pritchards were no longer content to operate solely within Georgia and its bordering states. The speed of the disappearances increased. Where once a year or more might pass between victims, now only months, or even weeks, separated one vanishing from the next. It was as if they no longer feared discovery. Or perhaps they felt untouchable. One winter evening in 1851, Mrs. Fairchild wrote her longest and most chilling entry yet. She described waking to the sound of screaming, a raw, panicked voice that rose and fell like a drowning person calling for help. The cries came from the direction of the river. She lit a lamp and crept to her upstairs window. The night was moonless, but she could make out figures moving in the distance, their lanterns swaying like restless fireflies. She counted 5 men. 2 carried something long and heavy between them, wrapped in what looked like a sheet. The screams stopped abruptly. Moments later, the figures reached the outbuilding, and the door shut behind them. Mrs. Fairchild remained at her window until the lanterns reappeared, this time heading toward the riverbank. The men loaded the wrapped object into a flat-bottomed boat, pushed off into the current, and disappeared into the dark. In the years that followed, The local community seemed caught between fear and willful ignorance. Everyone knew something was wrong, but few dared speak of it openly. The Pritchards continued their public lives, hosting occasional business gatherings, attending church on high holidays, and making generous donations to public works. Yet beneath that thin layer of respectability lay an operation that had grown far beyond the whispers of missing brides. Whatever had begun as a calculated scheme to prey on vulnerable women had transformed into something larger, more dangerous, and far harder to trace. And all the while, the river kept its secrets. If you like, I can make part 8 pick up with the moment the first real witness comes forward, someone from inside the Pritchard operation who risks everything to reveal what was happening in that outbuilding. That would push the tension toward its breaking point. Do you want me to proceed with that next? Part 8: The Ledger of Names. By the summer of 1850, the Pritchard brothers' operation had grown into something far larger than even the most suspicious neighbor could have imagined. But it was not until the discovery of the ledger that the true scale, and the cold precision, of their crimes became undeniable. The ledger was found entirely by accident. According to a sworn account later given by Mrs. Fairchild's nephew, Samuel Whitcomb, the young man had been tasked with retrieving a bundle of dried tobacco leaves from the disused curing shed near the river. The shed's roof sagged from years of neglect, and one of its walls bore a long, weathered crack that allowed sunlight to spill through in dusty beams. Samuel, who had a habit of poking into places he shouldn't, noticed that a section of the floorboards sounded hollow when he stepped on them. Curiosity overruled good sense. He fetched a crowbar from the tool rack and pried up the warped planks, expecting perhaps a cache of smuggled liquor or a runaway slave's hidden possessions. What he found instead was a small wooden chest, no larger than a bread box, locked but so old the latch crumbled at the first twist of the crowbar. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth to protect it from damp, lay a thick leather-bound book. The pages were filled with neat, deliberate handwriting, names, dates, locations, and in many cases, brief notes written in a cryptic shorthand. At first Samuel assumed it to be some kind of plantation account book, until he began to recognize certain details: women's names, each followed by a town or county, and then a final column that always ended in the same chilling phrase, "settled." The earliest entries dated back to 1837. The names stretched across the decade like gravestones in ink, each representing a woman who had, in all likelihood, met the same grim fate. By Samuel's rough count, there were more than 30 names in the book, and the most recent entry was dated less than a month earlier. When Mrs. Fairchild saw the ledger, she understood at once what it represented. The shorthand, once deciphered with patience and comparison, revealed a methodical record of each acquisition. The brothers had even assigned each woman a code, letters denoting which brother had secured her, numbers indicating the value of her dowry, and symbols that appeared to reference the method used in her disposal. Particularly disturbing were the small notations in the margins: light resistance, requires care, assets transferred. In a few cases, the brothers had recorded instances where the woman's disappearance had drawn unwanted attention, followed by terse comments such as, "dealt with," or "route closed." The ledger's existence confirmed something the community had long suspected but never been able to prove: that the disappearances were not tragic accidents or misfortunes of travel, but deliberate acts of predation. The Pritchards were not opportunists. They were running a business. It was around this same time that Reverend Coggins, still quietly pursuing his own investigation into the false marriage records, began corresponding with ministers in other states. What he learned matched the ledger's entries with disturbing accuracy. A Miss Eleanor Briggs, who had vanished from a boarding house in Charleston in 1844, appeared in the book under Jeremiah's code. Miss Ruth Ashford, from Knoxville, missing since 1848, was clearly marked under Ezekiel's symbol. The brothers had left a trail of vanished women stretching from the Virginia Tidewater to the Mississippi Valley, a trail invisible only because no single community saw more than 1 or 2 disappearances, and because the victims had been chosen precisely for their lack of protectors. Mrs. Fairchild's notes for this period reveal an escalation in the brothers' activity. She recorded seeing not just strangers arriving at the plantation under cover of night, but also the movement of large crates being transferred from wagons to the river dock. The slaves, she noted, had become almost superstitiously fearful of the outbuilding by the water, crossing themselves when they passed and muttering in hushed tones about the place where the cries come from. One elderly slave, whom Mrs. Fairchild's maid overheard, referred to the river dock as the passage. When asked what that meant, he refused to speak further, only shaking his head and spitting on the ground. The final, damning detail came when Samuel Whitcomb, perhaps emboldened by his earlier find, crept into the river outbuilding on a moonless night. There, hidden beneath a tarp, he discovered what he later described as a cage, large enough for a grown person to stand in, made of iron and fitted with locks on every side. Beside it lay several lengths of chain, a coil of rope still stiff with saltwater, and a canvas sack containing what he swore were women's dresses, torn and stained. Samuel's discovery should have ended the brothers' reign of terror, but the reality of antebellum Georgia was far less straightforward. The Pritchards were wealthy, influential men with deep connections in local politics. Accusing them without irrefutable proof would have meant ruin, or worse, for anyone foolish enough to try. Mrs. Fairchild, though deeply shaken, understood this. She told Samuel to put the ledger back where he found it, to say nothing to anyone, and to leave the shed exactly as it was. But she herself began copying the ledger's contents in secret, creating a duplicate record that could survive if the original disappeared. Over the following months, the tension in the community became almost unbearable. Whispers about the Pritchards' true nature began to spread beyond Bartow County. Merchants grew wary of doing business with them. Mothers quietly warned their daughters to avoid speaking with the brothers. Yet, despite the growing suspicion, the Pritchards showed no signs of slowing their operation. If anything, they seemed to intensify their efforts, perhaps sensing that their time was running short. The ledger's later pages contained entries in a new, more hurried hand, and several victims were recorded within mere weeks of each other, a sharp contrast to the slow, careful pattern of earlier years. The final name entered before the ledger's discovery was Miss Abigail Turner, Fayetteville, North Carolina. Next to her name was a single chilling notation: secured, passage immediate. Mrs. Fairchild's copy preserved this entry exactly, including the date, July 3, 1850. Abigail Turner, according to a small notice in a Fayetteville newspaper, had left to marry a wealthy Georgia planter. She was never heard from again. In retrospect, the ledger represented both the key to understanding the Pritchard enterprise and the most dangerous secret Mrs. Fairchild had ever kept. It was proof, yes, but proof so damning that anyone in possession of it would become a target. By hiding it and making her copy, Mrs. Fairchild had stepped directly into the brothers' world of shadows and secrets. She would later write in the margins of her own copy, "Greater than, if they learn I have this, I will vanish as surely as the others." And though she took every precaution, That warning would prove prophetic, for the Pritchards were not the kind of men who left loose ends. If you want, I can continue directly into part 9 where the tension peaks and misses. Fairchild's life becomes directly endangered. That's where the horror will shift from background dread to immediate, personal threat. Would you like me to do that next? Part 9 The Unmasking. The rain had started hours ago. By nightfall, the streets of Cartersville were glistening rivers of shadow and light. Water trickled down the window of Dr. Harding's study, distorting the view of the town like a moving curtain. Inside, the air smelled faintly of wet earth, old books, and ink. Timothy sat across from Dr. Harding, his coat still damp from their earlier trip to the outskirts. His hands trembled, not from the cold, but from the memory of what they had just seen. The small house they had visited was supposed to be abandoned. Yet someone had been living there. Fresh footprints in the mud, a half-burnt candle still warm, and on the kitchen table, a stack of old letters. The paper was yellowed, but the handwriting was unmistakable. The same hand that had written the Pritchard journals. Dr. Harding laid one of the letters flat on the desk, his sharp eyes scanning the words. "They're still here," he murmured. "Whoever kept the Pritchard story alive, they never left town." Timothy swallowed. But why hide for so long? Why? He stopped. The faintest sound had reached him. Footsteps. Slow. Outside the study door. Dr. Harding looked up sharply. Without a word, he motioned for Timothy to stay silent. He crossed the room, opened the door, and found nothing. Only the dim hallway, empty and still. But when he returned, the letter was gone. They searched the study, but there was no trace of it. No open windows. No unlocked doors. It was as if someone had simply walked through solid wood, taken the paper, and vanished. "This wasn't a theft drive," Harding said finally, his voice low. "This was a warning." Timothy's pulse raced. He knew the stories about the Pritchards' supposed curse. People claimed that anyone who dug too deeply into the family's past met a mysterious end. Most called it superstition. Now, Timothy wasn't so sure. That night, he couldn't sleep. The rain had stopped, but the silence outside was heavier than any storm. Around midnight, he rose and poured himself a glass of water. That's when he saw it. A figure, standing across the street, under the lamplight. Tall, motionless, watching. Timothy's first instinct was to duck out of sight. But curiosity pinned him in place. The figure didn't move, until Timothy blinked. Then, it was gone. The next morning, drive. Harding was already at the table, surrounded by maps and old property deeds. "I think I've found where they took her," he said without preamble. Timothy stared. "Her? Who?" Dr. Harding's mouth tightened. "Sarah Pemberton, Jeremiah Pritchard's so-called bride." He pushed a map toward Timothy, pointing to a small, faded mark deep in the forest outside town. "There's a collapsed mine here. The records say it was abandoned before the war. But look," he unfolded an old ledger. "Land transfers from 1844 show the Pritchards bought it quietly. No one ever knew." Timothy leaned closer. "You think they buried her there?" "Not buried. Drive," Harding said, his tone grim. "Kept. By midday, they had packed lanterns, ropes, and a revolver. The forest was thick, the path barely visible. Branches scraped their coats, and the ground sucked at their boots with every step. They reached the mine entrance just before sunset. The opening was half hidden by vines, its wooden beams rotted and warped. A smell drifted out, damp stone, mixed with something older. Something faintly sweet and foul. Timothy's lantern cast long, trembling shadows on the walls as they stepped inside. At first, the tunnel was just dirt and rock. But deeper in, they found the carvings. Small, rough etchings in the stone, names, dates, symbols Timothy didn't recognize. And then, a word, repeated over and over. Bride. The deeper they went, the colder it became. The air grew heavy, each breath a struggle. Timothy's lantern flickered. Keep moving, drive, Harding urged. They turned a corner, and froze. Ahead lay a chamber. In the center, an old wooden chair stood beneath a beam of light from a hole in the ceiling. On the chair sat a figure. A woman. Her hair was long and pale, her dress faded and yellowed with age. At first, Timothy thought she was a preserved corpse. But then, her head moved. Very slowly, she turned toward them. Her face was impossibly pale. Her eyes, too wide, too still, her lips curved in the faintest smile. I knew you'd come, she whispered. Timothy's blood ran cold. Sarah, he managed. The smile widened. You're not him, Doctor. Harding stepped forward cautiously. Sarah, her expression snapped into something sharp, almost hungry. Not him. The air seemed to tighten around them. The shadows on the walls twisted, stretching toward Timothy like reaching hands. Then, from the darkness behind her, more figures emerged. Men, all dressed in tattered 19th century clothing. Faces pale and empty-eyed. Silent. The Pritchard sons. Doctor. Harding drew the revolver, but Timothy knew it wouldn't help. These things weren't entirely human anymore. One of them, tall, broad, his jaw square, stepped forward. Jeremiah. His voice was calm, almost gentle. You shouldn't have come here, Thomas Whitfield. Hearing his false name in that cold voice sent a chill through Timothy's bones. You know who I am. Jeremiah smiled faintly. We've always known. We've been watching since you first set foot in Cartersville. Sarah rose from the chair. Her movements were smooth, unnatural. She reached for Timothy's face, her fingers cold as stone. You could still take his place, she murmured. Stay here. Forever. Doctor. Harding fired. The sound exploded in the chamber, echoing like thunder. Jeremiah staggered, but didn't fall. His smile didn't even fade. The Pritchards began to close in. Timothy grabbed Harding's arm. Run. They fled, lantern light bouncing wildly on the walls. The footsteps behind them were slow but steady, as if the Pritchards knew there was no escape. Just as they reached the entrance, the ground gave way. Timothy fell, Harding's shout fading into the roar of collapsing earth. Then, darkness. When Timothy opened his eyes, he was lying on the damp forest floor. The mine entrance was gone, buried under tons of rock. Harding was nowhere to be seen. But in the distance, just beyond the trees, he saw her. Sarah, watching. Her lips moved, though he couldn't hear the words. Then she turned, vanishing into the shadows. Timothy staggered to his feet. His head pounded. His heart felt like it was trying to claw its way out of his chest. And for the first time since coming to Cartersville, he wondered if this investigation wasn't about uncovering the past, but about being pulled into it. Permanently. If you'd like, I can also prepare part 10 so the series ends with a chilling, final reveal that ties every loose thread together. Do you want me to continue? Alright, here's part 10, the final chapter of your horror series, written in the same simple, suspenseful style and about 1,000 words long, ending with a clear call to action for your YouTube audience. Part 10. The final descent. The storm raged above like the earth itself wanted to tear open the old Pritchard estate and swallow it whole. Rain hammered the roof, and every window rattled in its frame. Timothy Caldwell, still wearing the false name Thomas Whitfield, stood in the main hall, breathing hard. His clothes clung to him, soaked through from the earlier search outside. Dr. Harding was beside him, pale, lips tight. They had finally unlocked the last of the cellar doors, and now the truth was no longer hiding, it was screaming in their faces. The stone stairwell plunged down into the earth, each step slick with moisture and something darker, something that clung to their boots like oil. The air smelled of old iron and wet decay. "We don't have much time," Harding said, clutching the lantern. "If the water from the storm reaches the lower chambers, it'll wash it all away," Timothy finished. "And take the proof with it." They started down. The deeper they went, the louder it became. Not the storm above, but a low, steady sound that seemed to pulse through the stone walls. At first Timothy thought it was machinery, but then he realized it was breathing. Not human breathing. The stairwell opened into a long, arched tunnel. Rusted hooks lined the walls. Ancient barrels and crates were stacked high, their wood rotting. Strange symbols had been carved into the support beams, half hidden under layers of grime. Harding stopped suddenly. "Do you hear that?" From somewhere ahead came a sound like fabric tearing, followed by a muffled, wet thud. Then, a laugh. It was not the laugh of a man. They pressed on, moving quietly. The tunnel opened into a massive underground chamber, bigger than Timothy expected, almost the size of the barn above. In the center stood a black stone table, its surface covered in chains. Above it, suspended from the ceiling, was a cage, empty, swinging gently as though something had just left it. The far wall was not stone at all. It was bone. Thousands of human bones stacked and fused together with some kind of dark resin, like a grotesque mosaic. Skulls stared outward, their hollow eyes glinting in the lantern light. Harding's voice was barely a whisper. "This isn't just where they brought them. This is where they kept them." A movement in the corner. Timothy spun, his hand instinctively going to the revolver at his side. 3 figures emerged from the shadows: Hartwell, Lowry, and Vance. But they were different now. Their faces were stretched tight, their eyes shining in the dark like animals. Their skin had taken on a pale, waxy tone, and their movements were jerky, unnatural. "You shouldn't have come here," Hartwell said, his voice low and vibrating strangely. "We told you to leave it alone," Vance added, his grin wide enough to show too many teeth. Lowry's hands twitched like he was deciding whether to grab them or snap their necks. Timothy kept his gun up. "This ends tonight." Hartwell laughed, a horrible, broken sound. "You think you can stop this? We've been here longer than you can imagine. We're not just the Pritchard sons anymore." Before Timothy could react, the floor shuddered. Something below them was moving. The stone table shifted as a deep crack split the earth beside it, and from that gap rose something ancient and wrong. At first, it looked like a massive root twisting upward from the soil. Then Timothy saw the faces, half-formed, screaming silently from within its black, glistening surface. The thing pulsed like a beating heart, and each pulse seemed to pull the air out of the room. Harding staggered back. "It's feeding." Hartwell stepped toward the creature like a priest before an altar. "We are its hands, its voice, and soon, you will be its meal." Timothy fired. The shot cracked through the chamber, and Hartwell jerked back, clutching his side. But instead of blood, a dark, tar-like fluid seeped out. Hartwell only smiled wider. Lowry lunged. Timothy fired again, and the man crumpled, but even as he fell, his body began twitching, crawling toward the black mass in the floor as though drawn to it. Harding dropped the lantern onto the stone table. The flame caught instantly, racing along the chains and spilling onto the floor. The air filled with the smell of burning oil. The Pritchard sons screamed, not in pain, but in rage. Dash dash dash. The black mass shuddered, pulling back as the fire spread. Timothy grabbed Harding's arm. Run! They raced toward the tunnel as the chamber shook violently. Behind them, the wall of bones collapsed, sending skulls clattering across the floor. The sound of the creature's wail chased them up the stairs, louder than the storm. Halfway up, Timothy looked back, just for a moment. He saw Hartwell, still burning, dragging himself toward the creature, his mouth open in some unholy chant. Then the floor gave way completely, swallowing them both in a roar of fire and stone. Dash dash dash. They burst into the main hall just as the first floor began to sag. Rain poured through the roof where lightning had struck, drenching everything. The front doors had blown open, and the wind screamed through the house. They didn't stop running until they were in the muddy yard, the estate behind them collapsing in on itself. The fire roared higher, but the storm fought to smother it. For a moment, Timothy thought he saw something rise from the smoke, a dark, twisting shape with too many limbs. Then it was gone, swallowed by the rain and darkness. Harding was shaking, his face pale. "It's not dead. You know that." Timothy didn't answer. He just stared at the ruins. Dash dash dash. 3 weeks later, the newspapers called it a tragic fire. No one asked too many questions. The Pritchard name was quietly buried, along with any official record of what happened. But Timothy knew. Harding knew. And somewhere in the ruins, beneath the soaked earth, something else was still breathing. Waiting. And when the next storm comes, it will rise again. Dash dash dash. Call to action for YouTube. If you've been following this story from the very beginning, you now know the terrible truth of the Pritchard family, and the horror that still sleeps beneath the Georgia soil. Do you think Timothy and Dr. Harding truly stopped it, or just bought us time? Tell me what you think in the comments. If you enjoyed this series, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next chilling tale. Like this video if it kept you on the edge of your seat, and share it with anyone brave enough to read it at night. The storm is coming again, and you'll want to be here when it does.